that shouldn't be there. Sorry. So let's talk about stage 3. Let's talk about raison. So berries begin to soften. They change color, and reds, they start to turn red, and then whites, they'll get translucent or kind of amber yellow. This is when sugar loading starts big time. It starts to accumulate a ton of sugar. Generally, for y'all on the West Coast, this is going to be the last spray will go on at about 50% for raison. The reason being, of course, that powdery mildew, you can't really get new powdery mildew infections, I think beyond, I always get this wrong, I think it's 8 Brix, maybe it's 12 Brix, but I think it's 8. Anyways, it doesn't really matter. But if you're doing a conventional spray program, you're gonna put on a systemic at about 50% for raison. That's gonna give you 2 weeks of protection. By 2 weeks, you've gone beyond 100% for raison, okay? And then at that point, your fruit is fine and not at risk of new powdery mildew infections. Here on the East Coast, we continue to spray. The reason is the disease pressure is so insane here in the East Coast. Cornell has a grape breeding program where they make hybrid grapes that are disease resistant because it's just such a gnarly place to grow grapes in terms of disease pressure. That's not to say that. So it's not to say that most grapes that are grown here for wine are hybrids. Actually, most grapes in New York for wine is vinifera. I think it's like 60% is vinifera and about 40% are hybrids. People use kind of the hybrids more as like an insurance policy against the really difficult years here. Okay, and this is also the time when you're going to start taking tissue analyses if you're doing analyses at veraison, not at bloom time. So let's talk more about the characteristics of stage 3. So here, it's not so much cellular division anymore. So cellular division happened early on in stage 1. This is really all that's happening now is cellular expansion. The berries are accumulating anthocyanins, right, like for the red grapes. Then our organic acids are decreasing. Really, our malic acid is decreasing because it's becoming a major respiratory substrate, which we'll talk about. And the pHs are increasing because of that degradation of malic acid, but also simply because of dilution with water, and also displacement with some cations like potassium. Sugar rapidly is accumulating, and then we're also getting some flavors and flavor precursors accumulating during this time. So this is what primary chemistry looks like during stage 3, and so you can see the sugar loading. So this here is Brix on the y-axis, and this is just time here. And so sugar is accumulating there, and it's generally in this linear fashion. This here is anthocyanins, and so anthocyanins, interestingly, reach a maxima right before commercial harvest. They get degraded at some point. I'm not entirely sure on the physiological reason for this, but that's what happens. And then this here is titratable acidity. So you can see TA going down over time, and that's because of malic acid being degraded. And then you can see it just level out. Why in the world is it not just like a linear, like it looks linear and then it goes whoop and levels out? Why is it leveling out? I'll give you a moment to think about that. Okay, so it's leveling out because you basically just used up all the malic acid. This is Syrah grown in a really warm area of Brazil. So that's what's happened here. It's just you've used all the malic. So the rest that's left here is tartaric acid. And like I said before, tartaric reaches a maxima at basically at the beginning of a raison, and then it doesn't really get degraded during ripening, but malic does. All right, and then you see pH increasing over time, which is kind of directly related to the TA, okay? So what's happening with malic acid? As you all should remember from other science courses you've taken, the beautiful citric acid cycle, or the TCA cycle, not to be confused with trichloroanisole, cork taint. But so remember the TCA cycle, this is kind of where we're generating some ATP and some NADH, like some energy molecules and stuff for our cells. And so remember, before the TCA cycle, you break down glucose, right? So you have glycolysis, you break down glucose into pyruvate, and then pyruvate gets fed into the TCA cycle here, and then we start making these, all that sweet, sweet ATP. Look at that sweet ATP. Where is it? There it is. Yeah, look at that sweet ATP and also some NADH. We got all kinds of good stuff in here. Okay? So, right, but we need that glucose. I want that glucose. My fruit wants that glucose, right? So veraison happens and we're feeding sugar now from our leaves to our fruit. So now in the TCA cycle, we're like, all right, we're not going to give you all that pyruvate anymore because we're going to take that sugar and give it to the fruit. So what drives the TCA, what's the major substrate of the TCA cycle post-veraison? That bad boy right there. So malic acid. So that's what's happening after veraison. That's why when we start doing all the sugar loading, the malic acid starts degrading. Okay? All right, so let's talk about sugars. So sugar is of course created in the leaves, right? In our chlorophyll. And then the major transport molecule of sugar is actually sucrose, right? You're like, what? Sucrose? Sucrose. So I know you think of, when we think of sugars in fruit, we think about glucose and fructose, right? Not sucrose, not table sugar. But that's how it has to be transported through the phloem to get to the grapes. It has to be transported as sucrose. If you transport it as glucose or fructose, those things are highly reactive in the plant. And so they'll be going down the phloem and they'll just get allocated to like other parts of the vine. So in order for us to transport, we're going to take that glucose and fructose that we made in the leaf, we're going to jam it together, make sucrose, transport that bad boy down the phloem highway and get it to the fruit. And then once it gets in the fruit, there's an enzyme called invertase. It's going to break it back into glucose and fructose. Okay. So yeah, the rate of sugar loading is increased by things like increasing temperature to an extent, right? Once we go above like 95 degrees Fahrenheit outside, the stomata will start to close and respiration is going to go down. So we're going to get less photosynthesis. So yeah, also in general, like heat and sunlight on the berry will in general increase the rate of sugar loading. So think about like, and maybe when y'all are out in the vineyard, look at a cluster that's on the outside of the canopy and then the berries on the outside of that cluster. Taste those and then put your hand around the backside of the cluster and taste those. Those are going to be less ripe than the stuff on that's more exposed. And that's because there's just simply more heat load on that more exposed side. And then so it's like enzymatically, metabolically more active. Okay. And of course, dehydration can increase soluble solids in the fruit, which I'll talk about more in a second. Dilution can decrease soluble solids, right? So rainfall can decrease soluble solids during stage 3. Or if you have overhead irrigation, throw that bad boy on. The water will enter the pedicel like rain does, right? So the pedicel is a little stem that connects the berry to the rachis, and then there's a little juncture right there, where water can just enter the berry. But yeah, throw those overheads on, dilute that berry down, increase your yields. Yeah, I'm into it, especially if I'm on a tonnage-based contract. And especially if the winemakers made me keep my fruit out to like 27 bricks and I've lost yield because of dehydration, I'm gonna plump those bad boys up. All right, so during stage 3, so remember that during stage 1, the tannins were being formed, right? So the things like catechins, epicatechins, all those were jamming together, and we were making tannins, right? And then during stage 3, those tannins will start to polymerize. Right? So we have these chains of things and then they just start getting giant. They start getting bigger. So at the end of stage 1 and stage 2, the berry is quite bitter. And if you were to make wine out of it, it would have been very bitter. But now as those tannins are starting to come together and polymerize and make these bigger chains, it gets more and more astringent over time. Okay? And then tannins, so it'll get more and more astringent during ripening. So your potential astringency will increase as you ripen the fruit. And then you might make this wine that's terribly astringent, right? Of course, that never happens with Pinot Noir because there's not really much tannin in Pinot Noir to begin with. But like Cabernet Sauvignon, if you taste like Napa Cab, like high-end Napa Cab, like when it's really young, it's very astringent. Like it's like having socks on your teeth, right? Over time, those tannins will then break up. They'll depolymerize over time, and the wine becomes less astringent, that's kind of what you're feeling when it's smoothing out with aging. Okay. Also, tannins can start forming polymers with anthocyanins, which may contribute to color stability to some extent. This is arguable, the contribution of the tannin anthocyanin polymer to color stability. But I'm not going to get too much into that in this lecture. But yeah, in general, with more sun and opening up your canopy more, you're going to get more proanthocyanins. You're going to get more tannins than if you have a darker canopy. So again, opening up the canopy can be very useful for accumulating tannin and modifying mouthfeel in a positive way, especially in the Willamette Valley, where it's quite cool. Maybe in Napa, we want to have a dappled sunlight or something, dappled sunlight environment, maybe not so open, because maybe we don't want it to be so astringent when it's young. But then we have to deal with methoxypyrazine, so I don't know. There's got maybe a happy middle ground there, right? So down here, what you're seeing, this is polymerization here of proanthocyanidins, and this is over time. I think this is starting from raison, but you can see there polymerization of proanthocyanidins increasing over time. Okay. Of course, color starts to form as well during stage 3. So anthocyanins are at their minimum, of course, when the berries are still green, and then they increase in concentration during ripening. Okay, but then they do decrease a little bit. Like I said, they do a little bloop at the end before commercial maturity usually. I want to talk about nitrogen a little bit. It's also something I'm very passionate about. That's what I did my research on when I was at Virginia Tech. And it's also, nitrogen is incredibly important for flavor and aroma precursors, and also for like fermentation kinetics, all kinds of stuff, right? So nitrogen also starts getting taken up into the berry during veraison in a big way, right? So here's amino nitrogen content. So free amino nitrogen represents most of the nitrogen in the berry. So like 50 to 90% of your yan is really made up of free amino nitrogen. So here's veraison here, and then you can see it just goes woo, goes crazy. Don't worry about the treatments in this work, but you can just see that from veraison on, you get a massive increase in nitrogen in the fruit. This here is showing, so there's 2 major times of uptake. So this black line is whole vine uptake of nitrogen. So there's at bloom time, the vine's really taking up a ton of nitrogen from the roots. Before bloom, the vine's really using its own internal reserves of carbohydrates and nutrients. At bloom time, it switches over, and now the vine is a net importer of carbon via photosynthesis, and a net importer of mineral nutrients from the soil. So you get a big uptake there. And then over here at veraison, so this is actually looking at canopy, but you can think of this also as the fruit. The fruit really is taking its maximum amount of nitrogen at veraison, okay? And this is why applying nitrogen at stage 3, right, or right before stage 3, so sometime around veraison, if you apply nitrogen as a foliar spray, you can have this huge increase in nitrogen in the fruit. So that's what this is here. So this is urea, which is a very common nitrogen fertilizer, very cheap per unit nitrogen. It's the cheapest per unit nitrogen. And we can put it in the spray tank and spray it on just before or during veraison, and we'll get quite a lot of it into our fruit. This is urea that's been deuterated, so it's like a tracer urea, so that we can measure how much urea got into this fruit from the spray. I say this is not my research, but yeah. So that's one thing you can do if you want to increase use of soluble nitrogen in the vineyard and not do it in the winery. You can do it by putting urea on as a spray. All right. I think I have a lecture on this in my YouTube channel if you're interested in how to do this effectively, not cause burning and all that kind of stuff. Okay. This is something I think this was in one of the readings that Scott had you read, which I assume all of you did the reading. I certainly did all of the reading in university, every single thing, right? Um, I did a lot of it. All right, but when we're in school, it's you've got a lot going on. So I like this. So this goes over those three stages of berry development, and then they've broken down stages of raison. I really like this. So you have stage one, which is that sugar loading, and then the phloem. So remember, the sugar is being loaded from the phloem into the grape, right? That connection gets severed. So remember, the xylem connection essentially gets severed at the start of a raison, which is why it doesn't matter. Like when we can just dump water on the vineyard and berries aren't going to grow anymore during stage three, but because the phloem isn't really impacted so much by water, right? It's still loading water into the fruit, but whether or not we have a deficit doesn't matter to the phloem. Okay, it's loading water into the fruit because it's also loading solutes, so it needs something to carry the solutes. Okay, so then at around 25 Brix, that phloem is also disrupted. So now essentially you have basically like zero vascular connection between the grape and the grapevine at 25 Brix. So now anything beyond 25 Brix is dehydration. Okay, so now our berries are just shriveling. All right, and then like raisoning. I don't entirely understand the difference here, dehydration and raisoning. It's the same thing to me, but you know. So yeah, so this is just something to keep in mind if you're dealing with fruit. Like y'all might be dealing with some fruit from like Walla Walla, Syrah. Syrah tends to the mesocarp kind of starts to like die off. The cells start dying for some reason, even kind of before 25 Brix, which is interesting. So Syrah always kind of comes in looking a little bit like dehydrated when it's ripe. But also like with Syrah, a lot of people will hang that for a really long time. They want to get these big dark wines. Like a lot of like Hunter Valley Syrah actually comes into the cellar at like 27 Brix, 28 Brix, and then you add water back. You might do an RO to get it to kind of a more manageable alcohol. I mean, they're still going to be very high alcohol. But if you're dealing with that kind of stuff, right, just know that once you go beyond 25 Brix, essentially, and this is like a rough number, this is not really based on science or anything, it's based more on practice, but roughly every brick above 25 Brix is a 5% reduction in yield. So if you get to 27 Brix, then you've reduced yields by about 10%, okay? But when you do get overripe and you are shrinking stuff down and raisoning stuff, dehydrating stuff, you're concentrating a bunch of secondary metabolites. So there could be value in doing this, and this is like why people do get stuff beyond 25 Brix when you're in Australia, like all that Shiraz, that big Australian Shiraz, because they want to get that concentration in that wine, okay? But you see it also like when we make wines like Amarone and you dry the fruit out before you go to fermentation, that's what they're doing. They're just trying to concentrate stuff up, okay? All right, cool. That's the end of the lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, maybe we can set up like a time to Zoom or something as a group. I'd be down to do that. I'm also down, like if Scott wants to share my my phone number, you can just give me a ring sometime on the phone. Any time, doesn't matter. Like if I don't pick up, text me. I would say email me, but I get a ton of emails, so it's much easier just to get me on the phone. Cool. All right. Well, this was really fun. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you are all well in my beautiful home state of Oregon. Thank you so much.